Hello Internet, this is Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and today I just want to take a second to talk about game balance. In particular, the effect that the video game nature of the new player base has had on our favorite tabletop role-playing games in their newest editions. As is typically the case, this is going to be most prevalent in Dungeons & Dragons, just because D&D is the largest of these games and the most ubiquitous, so it gives us the largest sample size. But you do see this in all of our tabletop role-playing games. All the new editions have made a trend that takes its game design cues from large-scale multiplayer role-playing games and other video games as opposed to the traditional elements of TTRPGs. See you on the other side. So when I look at the effect of the newer player base on our game balancing, the way the designers balance these tabletop role-playing games, I think you first have to understand what I mean by the video gamer mentality or the video gamer role-playing. What I'm talking about is a generational divide into two primary groups of TTRPG. The first group, the traditionalist, we're talking about people who would have been introduced early into role-playing games and who would have been young teenagers through early college years between AD&D in the late 70s and the beginnings of 3.5 in the early 2000s, using Dungeons & Dragons to keep time here. With the tweeners, or the people who kind of exhibit some parts of both, being the people who would have been early teens to college in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s through 3.5. Now, the differences come from the approach that they would have had to tabletop role-playing. And that is, there was no video games that were anything like this. The closest you had was in the very later years of that traditionalist mindset. You would have had some top-down adventure games like a Zelda, and you would have had some JRPGs like a Final Fantasy. You didn't have really any true role-playing games the way you do now. Yes, you had MMOs like Ultima and EverQuest that were around at the time, but they were not the kind of thing that was really out there and was really well known. They weren't anywhere near as popular or as accessible. And you had the internet, but the internet was not quite the tool it is now, nor was it as mainstream or as really as easily accessible. You didn't have it in your pocket on your phone. You had to go sit down at a computer, dial up. You may have had some of the early high-speed connections. You had to know where you were going. You didn't have Facebook and MySpace and that sort of thing. MySpace, there I am, dating myself. That gave the traditionalist two primary things, newer players. The first is a mentality of ubiquitous player base. The modern tabletop role-playing game player is used to a world where they can easily find and access groups, and it has just gotten progressively easier. I can go online right now into a Facebook forum and I can start 3 games in any edition I want with 3 completely different groups of people I've never met over a Discord server, and I can set them all up within a day or two. I can hop in, and if I'm a player especially, I can hop in and out of games left and right. And if I'm a dungeon master, all I have to do is post, hey, I'm hosting a 3.5 game, and bam, I've got more players than I can handle. Now, some of them are going to fall out and flake out, but that's part of that mentality too. The traditionalists didn't have that. Now, there's a reason that stereotype of the Dungeons & Dragons player being a basement-dwelling social reject for a reason. And that's because you had to go find a group. And your local high school, unless you're in a big city, may have only had one or two groups worth of people to choose from that you had to get to play. Even when you got into college age, your college campus may have had only a handful of groups to choose from, and God forbid you got kicked out of one. It wasn't every comic book store has a back room where everybody's playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it wasn't hop on the internet and find all the people who play in your area. It was if you had a group, that was a good thing, and you sure didn't want to be the guy who got kicked out of it. As a matter of fact, a lot of us learned to tolerate that guy or other negative player stereotypes such as the murder hobo and whatnot. The reason why you hear a lot of these older GMs knowing how to handle that thing is because we couldn't afford to lose the player because he was a jackass. We had to find a way to work around him or correct him or bring him into the fold because it was hard to replace him. Nowadays, you just boot him out of your group and go on Facebook and find you a replacement. The second big thing is the atomistic mindset of the video gamer. We, as traditionalists, came to the game from the perspective of people who were reading books. We weren't playing a video game with less rules because it was cool. We weren't thinking, man, this is like Skyrim, only some more options. We were thinking The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, Wizard of Earthsea, Dragon Riders of Pern, The Belgariad. We were thinking about party composition on those lines. We were thinking about abilities on those lines. We were thinking about it from a literary perspective, not a game perspective. We are playing out these books that were limited only by our imagination. And everything was about the group. Even in early D&D, which was way more about adventuring, hacking, and slashing, and way less about role-playing, even then, it was an idea of putting together the correct, that band that grows together and becomes something more as a group. The modern group that was raised on video games and brought into the hobby through things like World of Warcraft or MOBAs such as League of Legends or the console and single player video games like Skyrim, Elder Scrolls, and Fallout, or Dragon Age, these sort of things. Those players look at it from a completely different perspective when it comes to balance. It is not about balancing the party first or balance of a party composition against what can come at them. It is about balancing individual characters against the game and against each other. And as a player, a lot of times they're looking for what is the best, which one can be exploited, because in a video game they have limitations, whereas the imagination in those books, in those stories, was limitless. The world of a video game is highly restricted because no matter what, you run against the edge of the program. So it calls for a different set of balance. What this has done to tabletop role-playing games is, in my opinion, unbelievably negative. And it's because of those lack of restrictions that the video game balancing mentality does not work. When you balance a video game, even a multiplayer video game, it is not about parties working against the environment. Even in big-time PvE games, such as like a World of Warcraft raid party, those players, those characters, still have to progress on a roughly even playing field with each other from first level to whatever the last level is. They have to have somewhat comparable abilities. They have to be able to solo in order to level up and that sort of thing. Otherwise, they're not playable. And if there's a radical imbalance one way or another, it results in everybody playing the same thing. Then on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, the single player end of the spectrum, they have to make sure that everything is in some way viable, because you don't want to have a situation where a player can screw their character up and have 60 hours into a game and all of a sudden figure out there's nothing they can do, there's no way they can win anymore. So everything has to be somewhat viable. And playing within those restrictions changes the way you balance things. When you have a tabletop role-playing game with the limitless structure, it opens up a whole new way to exploit these kind of things and to just break the game as a whole. An example would be, if I'm playing a video game, if it's not in the program, I can't pick the lamp up and throw it at the guy who's coming through the door. I can't say, well, I'm not very good with my handgun, so I'm going to use it in a different manner. Instead of me trying to shoot this guy with my handgun, I've only got a couple of bullets, I'm going to shoot this bottle of baby powder that is sitting on the counter, and now poof, it blows up in front and he's covered in baby powder and can't see. I'm going to try something like that. You can do that in a TTRPG. You cannot do that in a video game. You have to keep in mind that mindset that there's not a limitation on my abilities in a TTRPG. I can attempt just about anything. Video game, I walk up to a wall. Sorry, you must have climb level 25 to climb this wall. If you have climb level 24, you're not going to be able to climb this. If you have climb level 25, you are. TTRPG, I can try. Or I can say, I can't really scale this wall. I'm going to shove this desk over there so that I can climb up on the desk because it's easier, then I can get to the top. I'm going to grab this broom and try and knock down what I'm trying to get at. I can't do that if it's not in the program of the video game. And the same thing comes through in the way they balance the classes. Used to, because we were balancing a party as a whole against the environment, you would have a wizard who was weak and pathetic in the beginning and eventually became like a god at the end. As an individual balance exercise, he was way unbalanced from a martial character. He was way unbalanced from an anything earlier. But he maintained a lot of utility because you could be very clever with how you use your abilities. I could do something like cast Obscuring Mist and then use Dancing Lights or Minor Image or something to create a phantasm in the mist to overcome a powerful enemy using 2 spells. That may be the only 2 spells my wizard who's level 2 has. That may be the vast majority of his resources, but it allows him to have use that is from the thought pattern of the player and clever gameplay and clever use of those resources that teaches him to be a better overall caster as he gains more. Video games, you don't have that. Well, we come in and we use a video game mentality to balance our tabletop role-playing game. Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, these wizards are super weak. We need to make sure they have an Eldritch Blast or a Shocking Grasp spell. We need to give them cantrips that have no limit. They can cast these spells as much as they want to forever and ever, amen, with no drawbacks. We need to have some way they can convert magical power into a special attack so that they don't have to use their dagger that's basically worthless. Now you've taken that character, and if you give him to that clever player, he has both the power of that clever use of resources and limitless resources that make him equal to the fighter that's next door to him. So now we're just going to start the caster as being better than everybody else and move him up. And it leads to a situation where you have clear metas that you did not have before. Yes, at different stages of the game, a fighter might have some advantages over a wizard, or a wizard might have extreme advantages over other characters in the way they're played from a purely mechanical standpoint in like a combat situation. But everybody meshed and worked together to form a balanced group to work against the environment and whatnot from 1 to 20 in the early games. Now you have clear metas where it's like every caster is going to take this spell. Silvery Barbs being the example in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You're going to take it. It's too powerful to not take. Then you're going to have bards, warlocks, certain types of druid. These are objectively superior to the other players, and they're just as good outside of combat or in more obscure esoteric situations because the player is good, and in the mechanical standpoint, they're just overpowered, and it makes it unfair and unfun to play really anything else unless there's some serious discussions ahead of time about how the game's going to be played to make it fun. So this video game balance mentality has brought some very negative things into the tabletop role-playing game space. That's why, even though I'm not part of the whole OSR movement myself, I really do have a strong support for it, and I think that it should be looked at carefully by all game masters to introduce the OSR mentality to new players, if only to help them rationalize and realize the mindset that makes the balance different in a tabletop role-playing game versus a video game, and to not push for designers to think along those lines and to make those kind of balancing decisions, because that is a direct customer response from these publishers. They look and they see the people coming out saying, this isn't balanced, and that isn't balanced, and this isn't fair, and that isn't fair, and I'm sick of my wizard having to go to sleep and rest for a day to get his spells back after one encounter because I get 2 spells and I've used all my magic missiles and now I'm worthless, because they were never taught to think outside the walls of a program. And that's not a hit on those players. That's not an attack against them. They were raised in an environment that was limited, as opposed to being brought up in an environment that limited less. So there's some value there to teach that. Tell me where I got it wrong down in the comment section below. Like, share, and subscribe. See you guys next time.